In March 1976, an atypical clinical case caught the attention of the medical team at Presbyterian Hospital in Chicago. The patient, a 42-year-old cardiologist, was admitted for a routine abdominal procedure. Until that moment, his clinical history was considered irrelevant. No chronic illnesses, no continuous use of medication, and recent cardiac evaluations within normal parameters. During anesthetic induction, the patient suffered sudden cardiorespiratory arrest. The cardiac monitor showed a flatline, and the team began resuscitation maneuvers at 10:17 a.m. After administering emergency drugs and chest compressions, the sinus rhythm returned 4 minutes later. The patient was transferred to the intensive care unit and remained under observation. In the first hours after stabilization, he reported detailed memories of the period when he was clinically unconscious. According to the medical record, the account was spontaneous, without prior questioning by the team. The patient stated he had observed his own body on the operating table and recognized the gestures and speech of his colleagues present. He mentioned seeing the anesthesiologist drop a metallic vial and one of the nurses pick up a stethoscope from the floor. Facts later confirmed by the team, as per the internal sector log. The medical director decided to request psychiatric consultation for evaluation of possible post-traumatic effects. Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, an associate professor at the University of Chicago and an international authority in studies on the dying process and consciousness experiences in critical patients, was then invited. Kübler-Ross interviewed the patient 3 days after the event. The meeting was audio recorded with informed consent. The man maintained a coherent discourse with preserved temporal and spatial orientation. He described the experience as clear, continuous, and real, emphasizing the absence of fear and pain. He said he had passed through a field of very intense white light and heard sounds he did not identify as voices. During the second interview, he reported an unexpected sequence. He claimed to have seen a mountainous setting with old stone buildings and a bridge over a narrow river. He added that the name Andreas persistently appeared in his mind, without being able to relate it to any memory from his current life. Kübler-Ross recorded in her report that the case presented cognitive coherence, absence of delirium, and vivid recall during a documented episode of unconsciousness. She classified it as a near-death experience in a medical professional, with characteristics observed in other accounts of the time, but unique due to the patient's scientific background. In the weeks following the clinical event, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross maintained systematic follow-up of the case. The patient voluntarily agreed to participate in a series of interviews in a controlled environment, held in a reserved room at the hospital itself. The meetings occurred at 7-day intervals, totaling 5 sessions recorded and transcribed by the psychiatrist's research team. From the first recording, Kübler-Ross aimed to maintain a protocol of neutral observation without introducing spiritual or religious terms, focusing solely on the phenomenological description of the experience. She asked about sensory perceptions, emotions, time sequences, and cognitive impressions. The objective was to understand if the account exhibited patterns similar to those observed in terminal patients, who often described intense light, a sensation of peace, and a perception of continuous consciousness. In the second session, the patient reported new images. He said he saw the interior of a stone house with small windows and an irregular floor, where an elderly woman called him by another name, Andreas. The detail caught Kübler-Ross's attention, and she noted, vivid content, with memory of an environment and identity different from the current one. No indication of mental confusion. The man also stated that upon regaining consciousness in the ICU, he carried with him a sense of incomplete return, as if he had left something unfinished. He declared, "It wasn't a dream. I knew that place existed, and for a few seconds I remembered a life that wasn't this one." The psychiatrist observed that the account followed a pattern of high cognitive coherence without significant temporal distortions. No sign of neurological damage was detected in the exams performed after resuscitation, including electroencephalogram and tomography. The patient presented normal motor and cognitive functions without hallucinations or dissociative behavior. Kübler-Ross, upon reviewing the transcriptions, highlighted the unusual nature of the episode. Until then, most near-death experience accounts came from terminal patients, usually with little medical training. This case, however, involved a professional accustomed to dealing with emergencies, fully aware of the physiological mechanisms of cardiac arrest. She noted, "The value of this account lies in the precision of the observer. He describes phenomena while his consciousness was, from a clinical standpoint, inactive." The absence of psychotic traits and the integrity of memory make the case worthy of controlled study. In the following months, Kübler-Ross sent partial copies of the transcriptions to fellow researchers who, like her, investigated reports of out-of-body consciousness in the context of clinical death. Among them was Dr. Raymond Moody, who had published the book Life After Life in 1975, containing 150 similar cases. The exchange of correspondence between the two solidified the importance of the Chicago case, considered one of the first documented accounts of a near-death experience in a healthcare professional. Kübler-Ross, however, maintained caution. In her 1976 notes, she wrote, "The goal is not to prove anything, but to understand what people describe when the body ceases its functions for a few minutes. Science does not yet know what consciousness is." In subsequent interviews, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross adopted a more structured methodology. Each session was divided into 3 stages: free recall, directed questioning, and physiological recording during recollection, monitoring heart rate, respiration, and pupillary response. The patient cooperated fully, demonstrating scientific interest in his own case. In the 3rd interview, the account took on a new character. When invited to describe the place of light again, the patient maintained a prolonged silence before responding. "It wasn't just a place, it was a memory. I knew the smell of burnt wood, the sound of iron wheels on the stones." He paused and added, "I think that village was in Austria." Kübler-Ross noted the reaction in real time. There was no sign of acute emotional alteration, but there was a slight increase in heart rate when he mentioned the name Andreas. When asked if he had known anyone with that name, he replied negatively. He only said that the word belonged to that other man, and that during the experience, he had the distinct feeling of being that person. Kübler-Ross's protocol stipulated that such descriptions be recorded without immediate interpretation. The psychiatrist sought to understand whether it was dissociative memory, dream reconstruction, or if the brain was projecting images from unconsciously stored information. However, the level of detail presented by the patient was inconsistent with these frameworks. He mentioned architectural structures, street names, and sounds of an old Germanic language, which he claimed to remember without having studied. The 4th session took place 2 weeks later. This time, Kübler-Ross asked him to verbally describe each element of the visualized setting. The patient spoke of a stone bridge over a narrow river, a central square with a clock tower, and a small cemetery next to a chapel. He drew a sketch on an A4 sheet, indicating the position of the river and the buildings. Kübler-Ross included the drawing in the study's medical record without adding interpretative observations. In the psychiatrist's logs, there is a note dated April 12, 1976. The patient demonstrates precise spatial memories of an unidentified location associated with a feeling of belonging. No indication of confabulation. Maintains technical language and a rational posture. In the 5th interview, the man reported an unprecedented emotional sequence. He said he felt the impact of a very old memory in which he was standing before a burning house, trying to save someone from the fire. The words came between long pauses, and at the end he commented, "This is not a dream. I have lived this before." Kübler-Ross maintained the neutrality protocol. After the session ended, she only recorded, beginning of the evocation of autobiographical content of a distinct identity. Consider the relation with the post-resuscitation phenomenon and aspects of non-local memory. The case began to surpass the strictly medical field. The psychiatrist realized that the account contained elements consistent with near-death experiences documented in other countries, but the content of memory of another identity introduced a new dimension to the research, the possibility that part of the consciousness preserved information not explainable solely by residual brain activity. After the fifth interview, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross gathered the hospital research team to discuss the collected material. The patient's accounts had been transcribed, and the descriptions of the location were precise enough to allow for an attempt at verification. Although the psychiatrist maintained a skeptical and methodological stance, she decided to request support from an associated researcher to conduct geographical searches based on the information provided. The sketch drawn by the patient indicated a village with an alpine appearance, featuring a narrow river, a stone bridge, and a central clock tower. The notes mentioned wooden signs, a bakery near the river, and an inscription in an old German language, the approximate translation of which was, "Time and faith are brothers." An assistant to Kübler-Ross, fluent in German, suggested that the descriptions matched small villages in the western region of Austria, near Tyrol. In the subsequent interviews, the patient demonstrated increasingly organized memories, reporting that the name Andreas seemed associated with an older man, perhaps in the late 19th century. He described the way he dressed, the type of coat, the sound of bells, and the mountainous landscape visible from a window. Kübler-Ross insisted that he relate everything in objective language, avoiding personal conclusions. Meanwhile, the physiological recordings showed stability. There were no signs of confusion, delirium, or perceptive distortion. The man maintained a normal routine, partially returning to his medical activities. The case, which began as post-cardiac arrest follow-up, was transforming into a longitudinal study on memory and perception during the absence of measurable brain function. Kübler-Ross decided to cross-reference historical data. Through correspondence with an Austrian colleague, she sent copies of the sketch and the description of the setting. A few weeks later, she received an unexpected response. A village in Tyrol called Sankt Andre actually existed with characteristics similar to those narrated. In the center, there was a stone bridge over a narrow river and a chapel with an annexed cemetery. The name partially coincided with the patient's recollection. Upon being informed about the real existence of the place, he reacted with contained surprise. He only said he remembered a house near the river and a carpentry workshop. He further noted that there was an elderly woman who used to wear a blue scarf and called him by a name that sounded like Andreas Keller. No other historical data could be confirmed immediately, but the spatial memory pattern remained stable across the sessions. Kübler-Ross recorded in her research diary that regardless of any interpretation about reincarnation, the case presented scientific relevance due to the clarity of the recollections and the precision of topographical elements of a location unknown to the patient. She noted that the priority was to understand how the human mind preserves vivid perceptions during the total absence of measurable cortical activity, a topic that, at that time, still lacked a solid neurological basis. The study would continue for more than a year, and the following interviews would show a gradual consolidation of the memories, bringing the case closer to one of the most complete documented near-death experience accounts by Kübler-Ross. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross continued to follow the case for over a year. The interviews became monthly and began to include indirect observation through voice recordings and notes taken at different times of the day. The patient had already resumed part of his professional duties, but continued to collaborate with the research. He showed curiosity without presenting signs of emotional alteration or seeking notoriety. As the months passed, the recollections became more structured. He described the village with increasing clarity, pointing out architectural details, household utensils, and local customs. He said he remembered working with wood, smelling the varnish and the smoke from the fireplaces. He also referred to a woman of austere appearance who would have been his wife in that other life. The narratives did not emerge spontaneously. They always appeared when he concentrated on reliving the moment of light, which preceded the supposed crossing of consciousness. Kübler-Ross observed the phenomenon with the rigor she always applied to her studies of terminal patients. She recorded that the content of the memories did not vary, even after long intervals between interviews, which reduced the possibility of confabulation. The patient maintained full lucidity, logical discourse, and the capacity for reflection on his own account. In one of her notes, the psychiatrist wrote that the case represented a challenge to conventional neurological explanation, as the man had described a sequence of continuous perceptions, while his brain presented, according to the medical record, an absence of detectable electrical activity for a few minutes. During that period, other doctors began to show interest in the case. Kübler-Ross, however, maintained ethical secrecy, refusing to disclose the patient's name or any identifying data. Her focus remained on phenomenological analysis. In internal reports, she compared the episode with more than 40 other near-death experience accounts collected since 1969. She observed that most contained similar descriptions: intense light, a sensation of peace, perception of displacement, and a panoramic view of one's own body. The differential of the Chicago case, according to her, lay in the presence of structured memories of a former identity with verifiable geographical data. Kübler-Ross exchanged correspondence with European researchers about the existence of historical records of someone named Andreas Keller, or a family with that name, in the Sankt Andre region. She received a partial response indicating that, in the civil archives of Tyrol, the death of a man with that name in 1894 was recorded, a victim of a fire in a carpentry workshop. The temporal coincidence and the detail of the fire drew the psychiatrist's attention, but she maintained scientific prudence. In her field notes, she wrote that the researcher's role was not to confirm beliefs, but to investigate phenomena reported with observable consistency. For her, each near-death experience case revealed an aspect of human consciousness not yet understood. In the case of the Chicago doctor, the recollections seemed to organize themselves as a complete biographical narrative, but without the emotional charge typical of fantasies or delusions. It was, according to Kübler-Ross, an effortless memory, narrated with the calm of someone describing an objective fact. This characteristic led the case to be classified in her archives as one of the most complex examples of preserved consciousness in the context of clinical death, and also as the only one to include autobiographical elements of another identity. For the researcher, the phenomenon indicated that the near-death experience was not limited to the perception of light and peace, but could involve access to memory content that transcends the individual limit of the self. As the study progressed, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross realized that the case required continuous follow-up and absolute discretion. The patient demonstrated emotional stability and maintained an active professional life, but said that the memories of the village and the carpentry workshop surfaced with unexpected clarity in moments of silence or fatigue. He did not interpret them as visions or dreams. He described them as concrete memories, stored somewhere in his mind that had become accessible after the cardiac arrest. During one of the sessions, he reported recalling the sound of bells coming from a tower and the smell of pine resin burning in the fire. Kübler-Ross recorded that he related multi-sensory sensations, something rare in near-death experiences. The precision and consistency of the account led the psychiatrist to include parallel neurological observations. She requested an electroencephalogram evaluation during the induced recollection process. The results showed a slight alteration of frontal theta waves, a pattern associated with deep memory and intense relaxation states without any pathological indication. The psychiatrist considered it fundamental not to introduce religious or metaphysical interpretations. In her reports, she maintained the clinical terminology of near-death experience and described the case as an event of prolonged consciousness in the context of reversible cerebral anoxia. In meetings with colleagues, she emphasized that the goal was not to prove the survival of the soul, but to understand the phenomenon of consciousness when the brain ceases to operate in a measurable way. The patient also reported that, at certain moments of introspection, he could visualize fragments of Andreas's writing, including names of people and a signature on darkened paper. Kübler-Ross took note without commenting. She sent copies of these notes to an Austrian local history researcher who confirmed the existence of handwritten records of a carpenter named Andreas Keller, who died in an accidental fire in 1894 in the same village. When informed of the coincidence, Kübler-Ross maintained her usual scientific posture. She wrote that, although the correspondences between the account and the historical record were notable, it was necessary to consider the possibility of unconscious access to information existing in old books or newspapers. However, she recognized that, in the case in question, the patient had never been to Austria nor demonstrated any particular interest in the local culture. The case continued to be observed until early 1978. In the end, Kübler-Ross compiled all the recordings, drawings, and physiological reports, archiving them in her personal collection under the title Clinical Case of Continuous Consciousness Post-Resuscitation. No formal publication was made, but excerpts from the study were cited in private conferences on near-death experiences. In her final reflections on the case, she wrote that the human mind seems to preserve a dimension of perception that transcends the known biological model. She observed that, although the phenomenon still lacked a satisfactory scientific explanation, the consistency of the accounts and the absence of mental disorders in the patients who described them were undeniable. She concluded that clinical death, in certain cases, does not represent an immediate interruption of consciousness, but a transition that the brain partially registers upon resuming its functions. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross would end her notes with a brief phrase, handwritten at the end of the field notebook. What we call the end may only be a change of state of the mind, the extent of which we do not yet know how to measure. In the months that followed the formal conclusion of the interviews, the case continued to be a topic of discussion among doctors and psychologists linked to Elizabeth Kübler-Ross's research circle. The psychiatrist maintained a reserved stance and avoided any public disclosure without scientific consensus. Still, the study gained discreet notoriety among professionals interested in near-death experiences. The aspect that most attracted attention was the fact that the patient was a doctor, fully familiar with the physiological mechanisms of death and resuscitation, which conferred unusual credibility to the account in similar cases. Kübler-Ross met the patient again on 2 subsequent occasions outside the hospital environment. In these conversations, he demonstrated serenity and balance. He said that, although the memories of Andreas still surfaced sporadically, they had become less vivid. He reported a kind of inner reconciliation, as if he had integrated that experience into his own understanding of life and death. He also recounted that, after the episode, he began to treat his critical patients with a different attention, more aware of what he called the subjective dimension of dying. The researcher recorded that the change in posture was a relevant clinical datum. Many survivors of near-death experiences reported lasting changes in values, priorities, and the way they understood human suffering. For her, this indicated that the impact of the phenomenon went beyond the emotional plane and projected onto ethical and existential behavior. The psychiatrist considered that the case of the Chicago doctor exemplified the potential for psychological restructuring that consciousness can experience after a reversible cardiac arrest episode. Upon reviewing the collected materials, Kübler-Ross realized that the topographical, sensory, and historical elements described by the patient remained internally coherent, even after 2 years. The narratives had not expanded or modified over time, which contradicted the pattern of imaginative constructions. This stability of content was, according to her notes, one of the factors that justified classifying the case as one of continuous consciousness with access to unidentified memory. In correspondence exchanged with colleagues at the University of Virginia and Duke University, Kübler-Ross mentioned the possibility that the human mind possesses recording mechanisms not exclusively located in brain tissue. The idea was considered controversial, but the psychiatrist argued that the study of such cases should be conducted without prejudice, recognizing that science still understood only a fraction of consciousness processes. The doctor, in turn, requested that his name not be linked to any public report. He argued that the experience was personal and that he wished to preserve his career without undue exposure. Kübler-Ross respected the request and maintained all data under confidentiality, keeping the records in her personal archive. In a final note, she wrote that the case demonstrated the need for medicine to broaden its view on dying, incorporating the subjective dimension of patients' reported experiences. The episode would end as it began, discreetly, without headlines, without definitive conclusions. It would be recorded only as a clinical study that questioned the limits of consciousness and the nature of what we call life. For Kübler-Ross, it was one more reminder that death is not an abrupt event, but a process whose understanding requires attentive listening and an open mind. In the following years, the case remained archived among Elizabeth Kübler-Ross's personal documents. She occasionally used it in private lectures for healthcare professionals, as an example of the complexity of the human experience in the face of clinical death. She never presented it as proof of the continuity of consciousness, but as an invitation to the careful observation of phenomena that challenge established knowledge. The patient continued to practice medicine until the end of the 1980s, remaining discreet about the episode. In a letter sent to the researcher in 1983, he thanked her for the follow-up and stated that the experience had profoundly transformed his understanding of suffering and the care of the sick. He wrote that, since the cardiac arrest, he had never again feared the dying process. He said he perceived life as a continuous cycle, without rigid boundaries between beginning and end. He also described that he occasionally dreamed of the Alpine village and woke up with the feeling of having returned from a familiar place. Kübler-Ross responded to the letter with a brief observation, preserved in her archives. When someone crosses the border of death and returns, the perception of what is real changes forever. The psychiatrist maintained this tone of sobriety until the end of her life. She argued that near-death experiences should be studied with the same rigor applied to any physiological phenomenon, but without ignoring the existential dimension they revealed. She considered that science did not need to explain everything immediately. It was enough to recognize the mystery as a legitimate part of the investigation. In a conference delivered in the 1980s, she stated that the real challenge was not to prove what happens after death, but to understand what near-death accounts teach about consciousness itself. The case of the Chicago doctor thus remained a silent point amidst Kübler-Ross's vast set of observations. It was not published in scientific journals or presented at congresses, but it was part of the collection of clinical evidence that helped consolidate the notion that the phenomenon of death is not reduced to a simple biological collapse. For the researcher, the coherence and balance of the account, combined with the absence of mental disorders, sustained the legitimacy of the study. When Kübler-Ross passed away in 2004, part of her archives was donated to a foundation dedicated to research on spirituality and health. Among the cataloged documents was the cardiologist's case file. The recordings, physiological reports, and letters show the portrait of a clinical episode treated with seriousness and respect, not as proof of something beyond life, but as testimony that human consciousness can resist for moments the complete erasure of the body. Today, the case is cited in studies on near-death experiences as one of the most consistent accounts recorded by Kübler-Ross, both for the medical precision of the observer and the methodological neutrality of the researcher. It remains a reminder that science and human experience are not opposites, but complementary, and that understanding the threshold between life and death may depend more on attentive listening than on any instrument. The doctor never spoke publicly again about what he experienced. He continued his life, dedicating himself to cardiology until retirement. In his last known notes, he recorded only one sentence: "The light was not the end, it was the instant when I understood that time is not the limit of life." And so, between silent archives and memories that resist oblivion, the case of the doctor who crossed the tunnel of light remains a clinical testimony of an experience that transformed, forever, the frontier between death and consciousness.